Margaret Thompson was a wealthy widow seeking love. David Brooks was a charming young man with secrets buried deeper than anyone could imagine. And when their worlds collided, it led to one of the most chilling murders high society had ever seen. Margaret Thompson had always lived a life of comfort and elegance. Born into old money and later married to Harold Thompson, a powerful real estate mogul, she had spent decades immersed in a world of art galleries, charity balls, and international vacations. Her days were filled with quiet luxury, and her name was known in every elite social circle in the city. When Harold died suddenly of a heart attack, Margaret, then 53, was left not only devastated, but also in full control of a multi-million-dollar fortune. She grieved deeply, but held herself together with poise and dignity. In the 2 years that followed, she retreated from public life, spending most of her time in her sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by rose gardens, fine china, and silence. Friends encouraged her to travel, to rediscover joy, but Margaret didn't feel like herself anymore. That was until she met David Brooks. The encounter seemed almost cinematic. At a fundraising gala for a children's hospital, an event she had reluctantly agreed to attend, David had been seated at her table. Tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating youthful energy, David immediately stood out. He introduced himself as a financial consultant, charming the entire table with stories of his global travels and insights into the stock market. But it was Margaret he paid the most attention to. He complimented her intellect, listened attentively, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on the charity's mission. For the first time in years, Margaret felt seen. The relationship progressed quickly. David began visiting her estate under the pretense of offering financial advice, but their conversations soon turned personal. He was attentive, thoughtful, and always said just the right thing to make her feel special. Though he was nearly 30 years younger, Margaret found herself drawn to his confidence and spontaneity. He made her laugh again, made her feel alive. The age gap, she told herself, didn't matter. Love was love. Within 6 months they were engaged. Friends and family were shocked. Whispers spread through the social circles she once held dear. Some suspected David was only after her wealth, while others were simply baffled by the whirlwind romance. Margaret, however, dismissed the criticism. She believed she had spent enough of her life living for others. This finally was her time. Her heart told her David was genuine, and that was enough. The wedding was a grand affair, held in the garden of her estate under a canopy of white roses. Margaret wore a custom gown designed in Paris, while David looked every bit the dashing groom. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and the couple danced under the stars as guests looked on with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. To Margaret, it was a fairy tale. To others, it was a red flag. After the wedding, David moved into the estate full-time. Margaret began making adjustments to her will and merging financial accounts, eager to start their life as true partners. She had no idea that behind David's perfect smile was a calculated mind, already working through the next steps of a far more sinister plan. Life after the wedding felt like a dream at first. Margaret enjoyed waking up beside David in their sunlit bedroom, sharing coffee on the balcony, and taking long walks through the estate gardens. He was always affectionate, always attentive, and constantly reminded her how lucky he felt to have her. Margaret basked in this newfound love, believing she had finally found someone who appreciated her not for her fortune, but for who she truly was. However, as the months passed, small shifts began to surface, subtle enough to ignore, but persistent enough to unsettle. David slowly began to take over more aspects of their life together, especially when it came to money. He convinced Margaret to allow him access to her investment accounts, assuring her that with his experience, he could double her returns. She hesitated at first, but he was patient, persuasive, and always so confident. He spoke of expanding her portfolio, buying into international ventures, and making her legacy even greater than Harold's. Margaret, eager to be supportive and flattered by David's apparent drive, gave in. With financial control slipping into David's hands, Margaret started noticing changes in the home. He hired new staff without asking her, removed paintings she cherished, and even suggested selling some of her late husband's assets. When she expressed concern, David reassured her it was for the best. He wanted to create a life that was theirs, instead of one that belonged to her past. Margaret, still caught between love and doubt, tried to convince herself that compromise was a natural part of marriage. But it didn't stop there. David grew possessive. He questioned her plans to meet friends, often suggesting they weren't truly supportive of her happiness. When she ignored his warnings, he'd act cold and distant until she canceled. Over time, Margaret's social life began to shrink. Invitations stopped coming, phone calls became rare, and even her closest friends sensed she was withdrawing into a world that wasn't truly her own. They tried to reach out, but Margaret, overwhelmed by confusion and a growing sense of isolation, brushed them off. Behind closed doors, David's mood swings became more frequent. One moment he'd be affectionate and charming, the next he'd be irritated by the smallest things, her questioning a transaction, a misplaced heirloom, or simply asking where he'd been. Margaret began to tread carefully, choosing her words and actions more cautiously. The man who once made her feel alive now made her feel unsure in her own home. Margaret occasionally thought about seeking help or confiding in someone, but shame and fear kept her silent. She worried that people would say, "I told you so." She feared what David might do if he thought she no longer trusted him, so she stayed quiet and hoped things would get better. But what Margaret didn't know was that David's manipulation wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. Each decision, each withdrawal of affection, was a step in a larger plan that was slowly closing in around her. And by the time she sensed the full scope of the danger, it would be far too late. Margaret's unease continued to grow, but she buried it beneath forced smiles and empty reassurances to herself. She kept hoping that things would return to how they were in the beginning, when David was thoughtful, attentive, and full of sweet plans for their future. But that version of David seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone unpredictable and increasingly secretive. He spent long hours locked away in the study, often claiming to be on important calls with investors or business contacts overseas. When Margaret knocked or entered unannounced, he'd quickly minimize his laptop screen or shuffle papers out of sight. He told her it was confidential work, nothing for her to worry about. Still, the sense that something was very wrong kept creeping in. Her instincts finally pushed her to act. One afternoon, while David was out, Margaret unlocked his desk drawer, a place he had always insisted was private. Inside, she found documents she didn't understand, spreadsheets with cryptic entries, and printed emails with names she didn't recognize. Her heart pounded as she snapped photos with her phone and quickly returned everything to its place. That night, she contacted a private investigator using an old burner phone she had tucked away in a drawer since Harold's death. She didn't want to believe David was hiding something from her, but she needed the truth. What the investigator uncovered in the following weeks shattered any illusion Margaret had left. David's name appeared in multiple lawsuits involving failed businesses. He had declared bankruptcy twice under aliases. In one case, he was suspected of draining an elderly woman's savings before vanishing. There were no convictions, just a trail of financial wreckage and carefully erased footprints. Even more disturbing was a connection to two previous women, both wealthy, both much older, both deceased within a few years of marrying him. Their deaths had been ruled natural at the time, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. Margaret's blood ran cold. She couldn't deny the truth any longer. She was not David's partner, she was his next target. Her world, once so full of love and hope, now felt like a gilded trap. The man who had once promised to cherish her had been methodically setting her up step by step for a fate she could now see clearly. But she didn't confront him. Not yet. She needed a plan. She started quietly speaking to a lawyer she trusted, exploring ways to separate their finances and protect herself without raising suspicion. She instructed her housekeeper to stay home for a few extra days, just in case. Margaret lived each day with quiet fear, pretending nothing had changed while hiding the growing terror beneath her calm exterior. She kept her movements subtle, avoided any emotional reactions, and hoped that if she stayed careful, she could get out safely. But David was sharper than she realized. He sensed her pulling away. The mask he wore for so long began to slip, and beneath it was a man who wasn't going to let go easily. Margaret's attempt to reclaim control of her life had begun, but she had no idea that time was already running out. Margaret's birthday arrived on a chilly evening in late October. She had planned a quiet gathering, just a few longtime friends, some soft music, and her favorite wine. It was the first event she'd hosted in months, and though she kept it small, the night carried a strange weight. She wore a deep emerald dress Harold had once bought her, and though she smiled for her guests, she carried a heaviness beneath the surface. She knew things couldn't go on the way they had. She had seen the truth behind David's polished exterior. Tonight she would act normal, but soon, very soon, she would begin to sever the ties completely. David played the part of the doting husband well at first. He greeted guests, poured champagne, and complimented Margaret on everything from her cooking to her dress. But there was a stiffness to his movements, and a distant look in his eyes. Margaret noticed how often he stepped away to check his phone, how little he engaged in conversation with anyone. When one of her friends asked about his latest business venture, he changed the subject quickly and excused himself. It was clear to those paying attention that something was off, but no one could have predicted how the evening would end. As the guests began to leave and the house grew quiet, Margaret went to the kitchen to put away leftovers. David followed her silently. The air felt thick with tension. She reached for a wine bottle when David suddenly grabbed her wrist, not harshly, but firm enough to startle her. He asked if she had been speaking to anyone about him. His tone was low, controlled, but his eyes were filled with suspicion. Margaret froze, trying to stay composed. She said nothing of importance, just the usual birthday chatter. David didn't believe her. The confrontation moved to the study. Margaret tried to calm him, told him they could talk in the morning. But David had sensed the shift. He knew her trust had broken. He accused her of turning people against him, of hiding money. His words became sharper, more erratic. When she turned to leave the room, he blocked the doorway. Panic rose in her chest, but she kept her voice even, trying to defuse the situation. Then, something inside him snapped. What happened next was fast and brutal. In a burst of rage, David shoved Margaret backwards. She hit the edge of the fireplace mantel, falling hard onto the marble floor. Dazed and bleeding, she tried to crawl away, but he struck again. This time with a heavy crystal vase that shattered on impact. The room, once a quiet sanctuary filled with books and warm lighting, became a crime scene. David stood over her body, breathing heavily, the reality of what he had done beginning to sink in. He didn't check her pulse. He didn't speak. He simply left the room, walked out of the house, and disappeared into the night. The lights were still on, music still faintly playing from the living room, as Margaret's lifeless body lay cold and broken on the floor. A woman who had once had everything now had nothing, not even a chance to say goodbye. Margaret's body was discovered the next morning by her longtime housekeeper, who had returned early after receiving an odd voicemail from Margaret the previous night. The message was brief, almost whispered, and mentioned that something felt wrong. When the housekeeper entered the study and saw the blood, the shattered vase, and Margaret lying motionless, she screamed loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Within minutes, police were on the scene. What began as a welfare check quickly escalated into a full-scale homicide investigation. David Brooks was gone. His phone was turned off, his car missing, and there was no sign of him at any of his usual haunts. He had disappeared without a trace. As investigators combed through the estate, they found the signs Margaret had tried to hide: her notes, financial documents, and the photographs she had taken of David's suspicious files. It was clear she had known something was coming. Her efforts to protect herself had started too late, and now the man she had trusted most was the prime suspect in her brutal murder. News of Margaret's death shocked the city. The media quickly latched onto the story of the wealthy widow and her much younger husband. Rumors spread fast, painting David as a gold digger and a conman. But what the public didn't know, what investigators soon discovered, was that David Brooks wasn't just a husband who snapped. He was a calculated predator. As detectives traced his past, a disturbing pattern emerged. David had been married under different aliases in 3 separate states over the last 15 years. Each time the women were older, wealthy, and socially connected. Each time David managed to isolate them, gain financial control, and disappear shortly after their sudden, unexplained deaths. 2 were officially ruled as natural causes, one a heart attack, the other a fall down the stairs. But now, with Margaret's violent death as a catalyst, those cases were reopened. David's financial trail was harder to follow. He had moved money between shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency wallets to cover his tracks. But his mistake was underestimating the digital footprint he left behind. Within 2 weeks of Margaret's murder, authorities tracked him to a rented cabin in Oregon, where he was living under yet another name. Preparing to cross into Canada, armed officers took him into custody without resistance. The trial that followed was explosive. Prosecutors painted David as a methodical killer who used charm and manipulation to lure vulnerable women before eliminating them for profit. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Life insurance policies, forged documents, and traces of financial fraud in every previous marriage. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges, including first-degree murder. Margaret Thompson's death became more than just a tragic headline. It became a case study in deception, manipulation, and the danger of misplaced trust. Her estate was eventually turned into a foundation supporting victims of financial abuse and elder exploitation. Though her life ended in cruelty, her story sparked important conversations and legal reforms. In the end, Margaret's voice was silenced, but her legacy ensured that others would not be.